Okay, Steve, let's try and understand a little bit more about 5 and 20, where
Okay.
it came from, how it developed, the genesis of this.
Yeah. Okay. So, um, I think in February 2024, I had a phone call from a friend. I'll talk about it at the beginning of the book. I don't name the guy, but pretty no uncertain terms, lost a friend to suicide. And he was the life and soul of a party. He was a cracking fella. And it really rocked my world. It was a real shock. Sadly, not the first, by the way. I'd lost another good friend, probably about a year before that to suicide, who again was a decorated soldier. And then there have been others that I'm aware of as well from my regiment and wider afield. And I can remember we were at Canterbury Cathedral in the chapel, and his service was being. And I just in my mind, I had this. There must be something I can do, and I'd had this idea of this book in the back of my mind. And again, the credit for that, it doesn't necessarily come from me, but the spark of the idea comes from. I was running a podcast with a friend of mine called Mick, and it was called 5 and 20s, and it was kind of genius. So we were just talking to veterans who had left the military and their journey. Some had gone through some real challenges, others had been pretty straightforward, others were still in the process of it. And it was that conversation and those conversations that was like the trigger for the book. The difference was the context of what I wanted to talk about was all about mental health resilience. It's about how we can utilize that SOP we talked about as a metaphor in terms of 5 meter check. You check yourself, and the 20 meter check is check your buddies, the buddy piece, and that led then to writing the book. And to all intents and purposes, the book had always been in my mind to write. It's a lot of stuff that I understand from coaching, a lot of principles from coaching, and then pieced together in a way that it's written in a language that service folk can understand. So it only took about 6 weeks to write the book, and then I sent it out to a few friends of mine to have a read of it and make sure that I wasn't talking rubbish and it made sense. And the overwhelming response was kind of like, publish this book. So January 25 we did, and it's been well received, really well received.
Good. Well done, and congratulations. As a fellow writer myself, I can understand all the emotions that go into that and the investment that it takes to have all these things rumbling around your brain, and then to be able to get it on a piece of paper, or you're probably like me with a computer sitting there trying to actually get it. Although, if I look at it now, and it's quite interesting, if I look at it now, 2 things that would change. First of all, I wouldn't write it. I would dictate everything. I wouldn't type anything, because one of my big regrets is growing up, and I used to work with a lot of Americans who could take typing as an option at school. But we saw typing as something girls did. Not boys didn't do typing. Girls may have done it. And I used to run an adult education centre, and people used to learn how to type. They had a metronome, and they'd sit there and do it in time to the typing. So in lots of ways, that development and that change has been around us all the time. Let's just, and I don't want to dwell upon it, but there are 2 things, first of all, you spoke about, and also the way that sometimes people struggle in that transition from being in an institution or a military institution and then getting into civilian life. And also the kind of challenges that go with that. From your own personal experience, tell me, what was that like? Was that really difficult?
No, for me, I think I probably broke the mold a little bit because I did a lot of investment in myself. So as a Sergeant Major, I did a degree in leadership and management through Northumbria University and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's quite scary when I committed to doing it. I had no idea what I was about to do. And then I can say from experience, writing a dissertation in Afghanistan is the most challenging place that you can write a dissertation. But I did, and I ended up getting a degree in it, which I was really proud of. So I broke the mold a bit in terms of my own personal transition, because I think through getting qualified as a coach, and I think just the nature of who I was, I'm somebody who is details orientated, so I'd like to learn the mechanism and what goes on behind it. I learned probably in the early 2000s, and certainly when I was based at the Infantry Battle School. So we trained corporals to be sergeants on the battlefield. I realised that actually my default setting to train was that of being a coach. So I didn't at the time realize that I was doing, but that was very much my approach to it. Is that, I have a coaching approach to imparting knowledge. So that's how I did it, and it worked really well for me at Brecon. So for me, the transition, I was prepared. I did education. I did my degree. There were other courses I did. I fully used all of my resettlement in order to get the very best out of that departure. And I'd already made a decision. I'd worked out that I'm going to go and start my own coaching practice. So again, it was that abundance of kind of like, okay, there's my next chapter. It's shaped. Now you just got to go and do it. The reality was, for the vast majority, many don't do that. They don't put the preparation into that transition, and it's a misplaced loyalty. And I don't mean it's a misplaced loyalty insofar as it's just as it is now, king and country. I mean it insofar as, if you don't turn around to the system that will support your transition out of the military, don't expect the system to support your transition out of the military. We're in the business of defending the realm, so the needs of the service is always going to come first.
Okay.
And your needs are close second, and your family's a close second. But it does give you the ability. Now, the reality is that you get, so I was a welfare officer, as I think I've mentioned at some point. You also get the regimental career manager's officer, who looks at the officer or the regiment or regimental career process for the soldiers, and then also those who are transitioning out of the military to help them in their next step. You don't get that out here. They don't have those organisations in business. So the military does invest in that, but the investment has to be from the individual to kind of like, right, make sure. So as I was welfare officer, if I found or come across soldiers that were leaving, they'd be told, make sure you invest in your resettlement, make sure you take the time out. Go and make sure you talk to the RCMO, and the RCMO, a good friend of mine, would do the same. Make sure you have a chat with the welfare officer so you know what the next steps need to look like. So we, but also
the exception, Steve, and it is an exception, is there are loads and loads of blokes who I think are of the same sort of age, and I don't know how old it was when you actually left the military, but they're lost in life and they want help and they need support, but they don't necessarily have resources to draw upon, do they?
So the army and forces is, it is one of those places. It's changing at the moment, actually. The 22 years, that's you done, unless you've got your career to go on. So obviously I was able to take my career on because of promotions and then getting commissioned. But for the vast majority, it's kind of like you do a time and that's you're done. And there's no other organisation where your time's spent and you're out. We've just invested all this money in you, now you're done. So that side of life can feel really challenging for someone who doesn't have a choice to leave. Your time is done. You're out the army. And it does come to us all at some point. And I've spoke to senior officers as well as junior ranks, and the senior officers suffer the same. So the reality on this, and again, when I go back to the 5 and 20s, it's not a mental health prescription. It's not a treatment. It's a prevention. And I think the bit that I would put here, in this part of our conversation also, is that it's about the narrative about mental health. So that whole transition piece you're talking about, it's very easy to put a label on there that, I've got mental health issues, or I've got PTSD, or I've got this or one thing or another. And the reality is that the vast majority might not. And it's recognizing actually mental health is a conversation. It's also, it's an education in how do we improve mental health. So the whole point of the book is about creating mental health resilience. Okay. So that resilience comes from exercising your mental health, exercising the mental muscle. We go to the gym. We don't have a problem talking about physical health.
No.
But we do mental.
Okay.
And especially now, there's a lot of focus with regards to, men's health or men's mental health and that.
So that I understand, this resilience that people build is produced by their mental ability to produce that resilience. Is that the biggest element of
it? Because that's what they're trained to do. So the again goes back to this misplaced loyalty of kind of like service. The needs of the service come first. So I'm going to do the operational training. I'm going to do this. I'm going to work to the last day. And then there's this resistance to that transition to becoming a civilian. and almost disdain towards civilians in terms of they're just ill-disciplined.
Never done anything, never been anywhere.
No, exactly. And I think actually for myself, some of the best friends that I've got now, I would never have had in the military.
No.
And the stuff that I've learned from folk, I would never have learned in the military. So when you start to enter into this and start to recognise that transitionary piece and what it looks like to get across the line, it is recognising that you've got to put some preparation in there, because it's very easy on the other side to start labelling it as mental health.
Right. I think we label a lot of things unnecessarily, but also the same thing. I think most people, including me sat here, have no ability, and you've mentioned it several times, of imagining what it was like being in the middle of a war zone like Afghanistan. I've no idea what that actually feels like. We may have had the training, we may have got the equipment and so forth, but I've never ever been there or done it. And all I view it with is huge fear.
Again, there's the whole premise there in terms of what fear is, and I've seen it and experienced it at the front line. So as regimental sergeant major in Afghanistan, seeing the looks of young soldiers that were just about to go out of camp and know that they're likely to get into another firefight, to go on an operation, to know you're going to clear an area and at some point you're going to get something thrown at you, as in like a mortar bomb or something of that nature, or you're going to be engaged with, so recognize that. But it goes back to what I said right at the very beginning of our conversation. If you're not in operations, you're training for operations. So the ability to train means that we're always going to be well equipped in terms of our response. But it's a dangerous place. And in the back of your mind, you don't want to be that person that loses your life. And so that's the fear. But that fear also keeps you sharp. And I again, the moment the training kicks in, is why we train so hard. The moment the training kicks in, then you're up and running. But the tempo of military life, that's that transitionary piece we talk about. How do we prepare ourselves for that change in life outside? And that's why this book's so important, is because it is about creating mental resilience, mental health resilience, to be a little bit more. Now, resilience doesn't mean that it is absolutely not, I'm just going to park this stuff and never ever talk about it again. Mental health resilience is kind of like having the resilience to turn around and go, I need to address this. It's about, you're acting a little bit different today. How are you doing? No, how are you really doing? Okay.
I think actually what you've taught me, and it has been a big important lesson as well, or reinforced to me, is that developing our mindset, whatever that may be, and it's spoken about a lot in terms of sport performance and spoken about in terms, life is about the adaptation of that mindset and how you face up to it, which actually is a nice and sounds very sophisticated and almost middle-classy way of describing what is actually getting your mental health in the right place.
I mean, if I could do anything, it would be change the narrative on that, because I recognise that there are mental illnesses.
Right.
There are physical illnesses. We don't struggle about talking about physical illnesses. We struggle about talking about mental illnesses. We don't struggle about talking about physical health. We struggle about talking about mental health. And
I make a big statement, and you may knock me down. I don't think men are very good at talking about health, full stop.
The narrative today is that we're getting better. I think we're getting better at talking about getting better. Whether we're getting better is another matter altogether. But the point that, so this is written for the military, and a lot of people have said, you should write this for the wider context in the business world as well, and I probably will. But if I look at this in the, in the business, in the military context, the reality of the book is that you could perceive, rightly so, that it's like, oh, I'm leaving the army, I've got the book. That book is needed in the army. And I know that sounds quite highfalutin of myself, and kind of like, saying that, well, that's the stuff that needs to be educated, but it absolutely does. So if you were in serving right now, and you went to the med centre and think, I'm not feeling it today, I just need to take a mental break, I need to take a mental health day, you would be frowned upon. They would be looking at kind of like, all right, okay, so what are we talking about here? And then they would start looking for the things. But actually, how many times have you woken up and you've kind of just felt to yourself, do you know what, I'm not feeling it today? No. Now in business, and I've done this over the 13 years, not many times, but there's been a couple of occasions where I've woke up and I've not felt it. And I've phoned clients and said, hey, we're just going to reschedule today. I'm not, on my
On
full
my
game. And you're paying for me to be on my full
Okay.
game. So I'm going to, but we'll get it back in. And I've done that a couple of times because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But it's a break. It's an empty of my mind. I now practice meditation every morning. There's a guy called Matt Young, and you need to get him in here, by the way. It'd be a great conversation.
Okay.
I'll definitely point him in your direction. Matt Young, and he gave me the nod. I journaling. So someone said about, oh yeah, you should journal. I'm kind of like, which is a bit of a paradox actually, because I like writing now.
Right.
And I was like, nah, tried a couple of times, never works. I now journal every single day.
Do you? Okay.
And I kind of like, I write out how the day's gone. I'm pretty, prescriptive and quite challenging on myself in both the celebrations and what's tough. What I've been happy about, how do I feel? Do I feel good? I said to you, I'm positive by design, not by chance. But I'm still human, and sometimes stuff pisses me off. Sometimes I've kind of some head trash to deal with, and so it gets journaled.
I like head trash, by the way.
And that's the reality of it. So I'm actively working to pursue. And by the way, the meditation, I started just doing it in the morning, but now actually I'll take a break during the day if I need to. And where my office is, I've got this tub chair down beside my office, and I'll just sit in that for a couple of minutes. And I'll feel that I've kind of like been working, doing loads of things, not loads of things, but working on certain things. And then suddenly I'll kind of like get, all right. You said earlier, 40 minutes. I'm recognized from my military days, 40 minutes of focused attention is kind of like a limit. So suddenly I get to this point where I'm kind of, I need to take a break. So I'm very, very tuned into how I feel. Me and my wife are pretty good insofar as, I'll say, I'm feeling anxious. A couple of years ago, I had arterial fibrillation. So as a result, my heart rate hasn't returned the way it should be. And so every now and again, I get this anxious feeling up here. And I'm kind of like, I'll just say, I'm just taking a couple of minutes.
Okay.
But
that's being able to look in the mirror and admit.
And that's the narrative. That's the 5-minute narrative or the 5-meter narrative. That's the ability. But that's not taught in the military.
Yeah.
They're teaching things in the military like, if you upset me, I'm going to hold a red card up.
I think.
Look, I'm going to upset you and piss you off because I'm going to give you orders, and this is pretty tough.
Yeah.
But I'm going to recognize if you're off par and it's deeper than that.
I think actually the difficulty and the challenge for you is it's a really huge bridge to cross. I feel personally, and I'm not inexperienced in a lot of different things. I know you experience it. I can see you, the epitome of the living embodiment of having been through all sorts of traumas and situations which I've never experienced in my life. And I too have been in situations which you will have never experienced.
For sure.
And often we do live very, very separate lives. But in order to have that relationship and connect sometimes, we actually need to understand that. Now, transporting or adapting stuff that exists in here into my life and the way that I live is hard because it seems to be in an environment that is quite alien to me, in the sense that, the idea of being in Afghanistan in all your kit with a gun and then going out on patrol and doing what you do, I can't even make the first step.
So let me cross that bridge for you, because actually you probably could. And I've had this conversation with, in the business context or the context outside here. So when we talk about fear, what is fear? It's a feeling. What actually fear is, it's the way in which we decode the feelings in our brain and interpret those codes or those feelings, those signals as an emotion, and fear becomes an emotion. But by the same token, when you look in physiological terms of how fear turns up in terms of anxiety, racing heart, sticky palms, butterflies, then I just turn to people and it's kind of like, yeah, okay, so how does excitement turn up? Now, I'm not saying for a moment that if you're serving that you suddenly get excited about going out there and fighting the Taliban. But how we interpret what we feel is kind of like the root cause to fear and to the other side of the
We need to
spectrum
decode it in another way.
Yeah, of excitement. So then the flip to this is I share a couple of analogies. So one of them is kind of like, if you're walking down the woods, you can imagine yourself walking down this wooden path. It may be slightly dark, quite closed in. All of a sudden, in the distance, you see this thing kind of racing towards you. And then suddenly, as it gets closer and closer, you can see it's a massive, great big German Shepherd. It's snarling its teeth, it's growling, it's barking, and it is on a mission directly towards you. How does that make you feel? And kind of like people will turn around and say, well, yeah, fearful. Now, I play golf poorly. Now I say the same thing as, if you're a golfer and you sit on an elevated tee, it's a par 3. You've got a water obstacle to get across before you get onto the green, and you're looking at this shot. You're lined up, your buddies are behind you watching your every move, and you're about to take the swing. How do you feel? Fearful. There's no difference in those fearful emotions.
Yeah.
The only difference is the circumstances and our interpretation of it.
So it's all to do with the environment.
And how we interpret that, and that's the bit that I want to try and teach. I can remember, there's a whole series of other elements that come into battle, into going into prolonged exposure for high pressure and fear. So I do appreciate. I'm not trying to dampen down the difference between being on operations and the fear of not making a paycheck.
My position is so. I know I get and I do understand that, but my position is one of absolute, almost adulation about the fact that you've been through that life experience, that you've had that experience, that you've been in those situations and have learned, and it's formed you and enabled you to be what you are now. And I wouldn't turn around to you and say, okay, have you ever sat on a one-on-one with some guy who sat in a chair opposite you who has abused his daughter, which is what the sort of stuff that I used to be involved in sometimes. I could almost turn around and try and say, I'll pick something really sensational.
I'm not laughing at that, by the way, but it's just kind of like the 3 years that I was welfare officer, I probably could say yes.
Oh, okay.
And again, that's what I think for me personally makes me a much more rounded coach. Those 3 years in that world, just to give you an example. So that particular thing, probably not in the... You were not exposed to it, but you lived in that world a lot longer. I only lived in it for 3 years. Mm-hmm. But in that 3 years, there wasn't a lot of stuff I didn't experience. No. Right from murder, who you remember young Lee Rigby, who was murdered. He was, one of my soldiers, all the way through to, everything else that you can imagine goes on in a welfare situation.
So I can imagine having done that and had that life experience, right? Your dial in terms of emotional experience is incredible, absolutely incredible. Mine's incredible, but in a different kind of context.
Sure.
And it's
Absolutely.
about how do we marry those two worlds together? Because as I'm reading it, I'm kind of going through it and I'm trying to go, okay, makes sense. I will probably, as a result of this conversation, and I do appreciate you for it, is actually get a bit of 5 and 20 thinking in terms of what it is that I'm doing in certain circumstances. I like the idea. As I was coming here and driving here this morning, I thought, in future, I'm going to sit for 5 minutes and just check everything that's going on around me, the circumstances, where my head is and what it is that I'm going to do.
That's the first step, yeah.
Plotting that path about what the next stage of this journey is going to be. And I think in that sense, bridging those worlds, and you use the phrase bridging, right, is the criticality to unlocking what has been invested in is huge potential. I mean, if I could be really cynical if you want me to be, which turns around and says, we as a nation have invested an awful lot of money in you, not to listen to you, and then not to get the best of all those skills. And every single military person that I have ever met or worked with has got an interesting story to tell. Mm. But, that investment and the development of that, they've all got interesting stories to tell. But I'm not so sure that we actually learn from those situations or actually recognize what a learning it can be to have those conversations. And I think on lots of situations and people doing all sorts of jobs, we could do that, but we're not doing it. We tend to be blinded or blocked and not listening to them. We've got massive resources and capability. And actually, as a nation, I think we've developed all sorts of resources and all sorts of approaches. And I'm sure in your military career, you also probably experience other cultures from other countries and recognize that they may do things differently, but they affect people in different ways, and the approach affects people in different ways.
Mm. No, I think, again, on that side of life, I've seen both the best and the very worst in the human condition, and again, it gives you a bit of enlightenment as to what goes on and why we do those type of things. And I think the point for me was I've been given the opportunity and the gift to share my knowledge and share my experience, and it was with the loss of my friend. That was the trigger point to put this, that into writing and to share it. And some of the stories that have been shared and some of the messages, not a huge amount, but I get a message coming through. I've just read your book, or I've just shared it with somebody else, or I've just tried my 5 meters, or I've just recognised who my a point man is, and the int officer and the SOPs, and pieced all that together and how my brain works, and recognize where I'm being self-sabotaged. Those are the little things that can make a difference. And I think, my mission with this is I want to offer it as a guide within the services. So, you can be in the services right now, and it doesn't detract from what it is you're going to do, but it will make you a better grounded individual. Because
I think if it's going to have a generality,
awareness.
Steve, my only challenge back to you would be to say that if you're going to push this out and communicate it in a broader spectrum, it needs to be called Take 5. Because I think saying to everybody, Take 5, kind of immediately would resonate with them.
I think the fact that a few folks have said to me, you should write this for the wider context. I think that point, absolutely. I think what I've written was something that was recognised, by the military. And so the 5 and 20s as an SOP, if you serve in the military, you recognise that as that's I know what that is. And then when you read the metaphor in the book and you understand the SOP and why I put it that way, it's kind of like that's where it resonates.
But that's because
there will be a wider context of writing that.
Well, there is, but also
audience.
That's because it resonates with people.
And that's
the narrative is told in the story and also the language which other people would recognise within those institutions. And I can see why its credibility would be so high. But I think if it's going to be more general...
Take 5 makes sense.
Well, to me, it's about... I feel like it says, I mean, the number of times in situations...
I might take that.
No, take it, please. Borrow it with pride, okay? Borrow it with pride, Steve, because I think in life, how often have people said, just calm down, take 5, slow down, stop, breathe properly, do whatever. But they're doing exactly what it is that you're talking about.
Yeah.
They are just doing the beginning of doing that. And then the work that you do at the moment, the coaching, is the bit where you're tacking on. Here are the enabling processes which will get you beyond wherever you are at that moment. I may be stuck.
And I think that the uniqueness of 5 and 20s is that hold the mirror up piece, and it is that buddy piece. Yeah. And it is quite unique to the military. You obviously get it in the other services, but it's quite unique to the military because it's kind of like it's a recognised... I can still remember as a private soldier, who my buddies were. And I can still remember my shell scrape buddy on multiple occasions, and different people throughout the years. And those relationships have been forged through challenge, hardship and pressure for life.
I have another way. I mean, you have a way of doing it, but I have another way of expressing that to the people around me. I call the people who I would do that with, and you call them buddies, I would call them my parachute packers. They're the people who Trusted I would trust to pack my parachute. Right? And there are very few of them. And do you know what? If I list them, I can go, yes, no, yes, instantly. Almost my ability to be able to meet people and also judge, and I am judging, their behaviour and go, yeah, I trust you to pack my parachute. I sit here and would reflect to you, I don't know you that well, but in the time we spent talking together, I would trust you to pack my parachute, which to me, in my world, is the greatest accolade that I could possibly
Just
offer.
train me first.
I would have to train you, and I would have to train me. But also with it, right, with it goes that sort of behaviour. Taking 5 and actually being able to control that and learning what those coping mechanisms are, to me, are so critical. But in the coaching world and the process around it, I'd have to pick apart the process and I'd have to pick apart the pieces. but I've actually got an insight about understanding between counselling and also mentoring and also coaching. Now that's given me a clarity which I don't necessarily think I had before, but I think that, so I really do thank you for that. And also at the benefit of all that you've done and the things that you developed, because some of it has been very painful. I'm imagining Steve as a younger person going through pain and discomfort in a way that I can't even imagine in all sorts of circumstances, and then growing and developing as a person.
Yeah, there are plenty of stories I could share.
Yeah.
Training for river crossings for a tour of Belize in Thetford in the snow, and having to break the ice to train to do a river crossing for tropical, environments. That was quite funny, painful in a different way.
Yeah.
No, you're right. I am the sum of my experiences, and I think, thanks for inviting me along today to have this conversation. It's been fascinating, and it's always fascinating when you're given the opportunity and asked the questions that force you to hold the mirror up and to reflect and to answer those questions with regards to what got me here, and in that case the book. What was it behind that?
I think it's a fascinating story. It really is fascinating. But also it's a fascinating future, simply because I see someone who is actually, as part of their goal, which is where my adulation really goes, as part of a goal, who is part of a constant learning processes and recognises in looking at the mirror, if I don't look at changing and developing myself, then the stuff around me ain't going to change very much at all. That power actually lies with me, not
That's
with other
the ownership
people.
piece.
Yeah, that's the piece about going. And the other thing I think, which you've talked quite eloquently about, and I think is really important, is about developing a narrative and the right language, and about how people talk and what it is that they're talking about and how they grow and how they develop.
I think that's where you mentioned earlier on about the generations and what we can offer as in that respect, and it's the maturity piece. As the elders, if you will, I think it's inherent in us to be able to educate the younger generation in terms of their maturity and as they grow. I see it in my own kids. For a certain period of time, you are their world. They listen to everything. Then they get to that teenage years where all of their friends are everything, and they know everything. And the most prevalent word in their vocabulary is "I know." Well, I think these days it's more like. And then suddenly they get to that age again where, they start to come back, and it's kind of like, you said, what did you mean? And what if, suddenly you've got that ability to be able to.
You've obviously been on the recipient, or you've become the recipient of conversations which go, you're explaining something and they go, I know.
Yeah,
I know,
100%.
I know.
The most expensive words in business, the most expensive 2 words in business are I know.
When you don't know.
When you don't know what you don't know.
No, you don't know what you don't know. I think it's really fascinating. Okay. I think actually I'm just now bundling all my thoughts about all the things that we've talked about, because we've been quite extensive in this conversation about a whole bunch of stuff. And it's about giving those jewels that we can give to other people. Okay. What would you say? What will you say, and what will the beginning of your inroads to somebody who's been incredibly well trained and invested in, but is clearly falling apart? What would your conversation be like?
How you doing? How you really doing?
Are they going to tell you?
Sit there quietly, and long enough they will.
So it requires patience to understand.
It does indeed. There's power in silence.
I think actually Stephen Covey wrote, seek first to understand. Okay. And it is about seeking first to understand. I mean, 2 things that I would say to you as an ex-teacher is that, first of all, we don't teach people to listen. We don't teach people about what they need to do if they're going to really listen. And you said something which I think is so significant, is 1, be patient and give them space. Give them time. And sometimes you may be sitting there for as long as 2 or 3 minutes and they're not responding, but they will eventually respond, and they will come to whatever it is.
And it doesn't take 2 or 3 minutes.
No.
just a few seconds is all it takes.
Mhm.
But you just got to be present. Again, I've done this on so many occasions where I'll ask a question and sit there quiet. People are uncomfortable with silence. And I think when you ask that question, it never ceases to amaze me how many occasions and how many times I'll have a conversation with someone and ask a question, get her an answer, and then I'll just say, and what else? And they fill the gap.
I think the other thing, just on a really, I mean, I've heard you speak, and you spoke with such eloquence, and it was really great hearing you talk about the eloquence and affection of your children, but also your mum and dad, and sadly your dad's no longer here, but also your mum, who will listen to this, and also, what would you want to say to her?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the thing that I and it's not what I want to say, it's what I've told her, is, these are the important years where you just got to go out there and be who you want to be. Because you've been everything else to everyone else throughout your life. Now's the time to just to be who you need to be. I see this with my own wife, with Sam, and being a mother to our kids. And like me as a father, it is an all-consuming position. That unfettered love for your kids, you'd do anything for them. And then there comes a point, it's like for instance, for me and Sam at the moment, the kids have moved on, and so it's a case of kind of like, there's a few things that we want to go and do, but it's hard to go and do them because you want to bring the kids along with you.
Sure.
So for my mum, she's done that. She's been through that whole thing. So it's kind of like, go do you. Every day's a gift. Go do you.
I think that conversation, that continuous and constant conversation, whoever it's with, under whatever circumstances, and I would say that about work colleagues and so forth, as soon as you start blanking people, as soon as you make a decision you're not going to speak to them, the realization of where you've got to. And you don't look in the mirror and go, it's all my fault. You look at it and blame them. You look at them and actually say, it's all your fault. And actually not recognize that you could approach changing your own behavior. Hell of a challenge.
It's interesting you touch on that, because again, it's the above the parapet mindset that I talk about in the book. Again, it's another principle that, from my military days, when you get above the parapet, you put yourself into peril. You put yourself in a place where you've got to look at the operational or the field of operations, where you've got to be able to see what's going on. And if you can see what's going on, then they can see you. And so when we put ourselves there, we put ourselves into a place of responsibility, accountability, and ownership. And ultimately, it's about the ownership piece. But when we're below the parapet, when we're in the bottom of the trench, we live in a place of blame, excuse, and denial. Because it's easy to blame other people because I didn't know. It's easy to put, excuses in there because it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my responsibility. How was I supposed to know? Or to just deny that I didn't know. I didn't see them. I had no idea. And the vast majority of people unknowingly live in blame, excuse, and denial. They live in a life below the parapet. We live in a litigative world where everybody is blamed for everything. Where, I'm not one to condone hurty words, but that's the phrase that an opinion will hurt someone now because they don't agree with it. And I'm kind of like, well, actually just get into a place of being responsible for who you are. Have some accountability.
Actually, to be honest with you, I think it's so volatile at the moment. People don't really realise the volatility and the power of language and the language that they have. I mean, prejudice.
Well, that's what I said earlier on. They've weaponized language.
Completely. I think I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's become, and when you watch people and you watch their face change in the way that they want to emphasize the words, it's hate and hurt that's behind it. And actually, it's not become easy at all to listen to people who are behaving like that.
And again, it all born through the environment. So we're without going overly political at the moment, we're a divisive country because there is division everywhere you look. One of the joys for me as a coach is I'm able to actually just deal with a person. And I think, if you're able to goes back to that, getting into the comfort zone, if you're able to help somebody to step outside of that, to take responsibility.
But I also think your worldview will have changed simply because you've had the opportunity to travel and be in lots and lots of different environments and actually assimilate with different cultures.
Well, periodically I catch up with veterans. Every Saturday I do a veterans breakfast. I've got friends in London that I go and meet at least once a quarter. I do veterans business networking.
Okay.
And again, one of the reasons for that is, it is we speak a common language, there's a common understanding, and there's a lot of veterans that I talk to today that don't understand or don't recognise the country that they went through blood, sweat, and fear. There's so many things that we did for all the right reasons, and people have had life-changing experiences. People have lost their life. We've lost colleagues along the way. And then when you see some of the behaviour from governing bodies, it is abhorrent, absolutely abhorrent, and I think, hopefully there'll be some common sense and change, in the not too distant future. But there are elements of the country that I don't recognise now, whereas the people that are here. So in the grand spectrum, the environment doesn't seem what it used to be. Now I get change and I embrace change, but there are things that I just don't recognise. But then when I go and work with a business owner or an executive at that grassroots levels in terms of what I deliver, that's what I recognise.
Okay.
The plight,
I would
the
actually,
drive, the
be
commitment.
much more outward about it. I mean, I think I live in a country, and I've been very lucky. I grew up living in Pakistan, living in Hong Kong, and I've been very fortunate to have travelled and worked in lots of different cultures. My fundamental issue, which we need to move beyond, is trading the truth. This country is fundamentally racist as far as I'm concerned. I kind of listen to people talking, and I hear the invective in their language and the hurt in their language. And actually, there's a lack of recognition, a lack of understanding, complete understanding on a geopolitical level about what's actually happening in the world. But also, we're living in a world where we have institutions like ICE in America, and we have the most lunatic president that I've ever seen or ever even heard speaking. And also, he's now supported by his co-pilot in terms, his vice president in terms of doing it. And I think the narrative has become utterly hateful. But I've also got an apology as we get towards the end, which is I haven't spent time, and I'm conscious of it, and not deliberately because I didn't decide to do this, I haven't spent time picking apart the process and the steps of coaching and what it actually is and what it means. And I think there's a lot of a conversation which needs to be there. It's almost like, here's the simpleton's guide to coaching. This is what it is, and this is what it isn't.
Yeah, coaching I think it's an interpersonal skill that ultimately everybody's got, because everyone's got the ability to communicate. I think what I've done over the years that I've been a coach is I've honed in that skill.
Okay.
I know how to listen. I know how to unlock potential through questions. Yeah, in the business world, I've got obviously a lot of strategies, and my toolbox is wide and varied.
Do you know what? I'm going to cut across that because, Steve, I think the only way to do that is actually watch it in action. And I'm going to suggest it would be great to actually film and sit and be a spectator, but facilitate that process with somebody who I know you'd be challenged by and actually enjoy being with. And that would be the head teacher that I was talking about earlier. It'd be great to actually work that, because I think people need to see the reality of what that would be like. And if you're happy to come back, I can organise that.
That'd be amazing.
And we better do that, okay? So what it would do is unlock that thing of people and say, okay, this is what real life coaching actually
That'd
looks
be pretty
like.
cool. I'd enjoy that. Yeah.
I know you would. I know you'd really enjoy it, and you'd enjoy the conversation with him. So I'll organise that, and I'll organise that with you. But to you personally, and I mean this sincerely, this has been such a pleasure for me. It really has. It's my world, and I understand it, and I do appreciate it. And I'm utterly, utterly empathic with what it is you've done. And I sat there reading this form, excited, but not fearful. Excited. I wasn't fearful.
No, I was looking forward to it.
I was excited.
It's been a really I think, you know, the power of strong, useful conversations. I mean, you know, the one thing now, the you know, with everything we said about the digital world, the fact that we can share so much knowledge, you know, and actually there are still people that are actively sitting here and, you know, doing that. I think that, you know, that's really, really
Well, my conviction
valuable.
is to want to develop it and actually say to people, I want to help those people and I invest in them and helping them. So I sit there with massive admiration for the entrepreneurial efforts and the risks that people have taken in their lives to develop their businesses or do whatever else it is that they have. And at the end of it, my gift to them is to say, well, there are the tapes. Now you can do whatever it is that you want to. And they have all sorts of choices. I don't want, and I'm just in a big fight myself, I don't want people to edit the life out of it. I'm not trying to make a Netflix movie. I'm not trying to do something else. I just want a record of the conversation. And I don't want it trimmed, and I don't want it cut and calculated, and I don't want stupid music coming in all over the place or it jumping around and doing that. And I just need now, because I'm working hard to find someone who's really good and is capable of understanding that what I want is just simple conversation. And I don't want it changed. And actually, to you, I would say, and I know you understand this, I just think its appeal is about the profundity and the honesty around the conversation rather than anything else. That's the appeal to me.
Brilliant.
So thanks for your profundity, which is deep and been invested in and actually is incredible, really. It's a great story to tell, and I know that it will do very well when it gets published. Okay?
Thank you. No, thanks for having me on board. I've really enjoyed it. Great conversation.